Well, the three papers that we've had so far in this series on equality form a narrative, and I want to use my paper to respond to that narrative. And the narrative goes something like this. Paper 1 on Jacques Rancière raised the question in the discussion time of the problems inherent in understanding equality in relation to a particular human capacity. So Rancière says all those who can understand orders that are given to them are by nature of that understanding equal. They show themselves to be equal. Equality is of those who can speak, for Rancière. Now that allows Rancière to do a great many things, but it also raises the problem of, well, if equality has to do with something that I can do, a capacity that I possess, then doesn't that risk excluding some people who happen not to have that capacity? We could say, for example, the senile, the very young, those with certain mental disabilities. The second paper came and responded to precisely that question, because Nancy's account of equality doesn't have anything at all to do with any capacity that I might or might not possess. It's not equality for those who are able to speak, it's not equality for those who can understand commands, it's not equality of those who anything. It is equality on the basis of having nothing in common. That's the way in which Nancy cuts off the possibility of attaching human equality to any particular determinate trait. Equality is not just for some people with a particular quality, it's for everybody. But both of those first two papers shared a problem, and it came up in both of the question times. The question is how, once we've recognised that an equality exists, do we move from that to saying this equality should be acted upon, should be manifested? It's the is-ought problem. So say that a slave, using Rancière's example, can understand and obey orders. Aristotle would agree that that's the case, but Aristotle would not then go on to say that therefore the slave should not be a slave. So what is it that moves us from recognising an inequality to saying that inequality should be mirrored or reflected or verified, in Rancière's terms, in a particular way? And the same question can be posed to Nancy. If we are all equal in terms of Nancy's singular plurality as those who have nothing in common, if we were incommensurable with each other, by virtue of what does it follow from that equality needs to weave itself through the way that we relate to each other, the way that we behave? And it's trying philosophically to bridge that gap that's going to be the starting point for the paper that I'm going to give. The way in which the third paper, Kevin Inston's paper, fits in is that Kevin was raising the whole idea in relation to Rousseau of feeling, of affect in relation to equality, raising the idea that it's got an important point to play in militating for equality. And I want to take that point from Kevin's paper as my starting point for a way of addressing this is-ought problem in relation to Rancière and Nancy. In answering this question of how to move from an is to an ought, I do three things. First of all, I show that if we want to address the question seriously, we've got to think about more than simply the is to the ought. Because if we all always did everything we knew we were supposed to do, there wouldn't be a problem. Knowing what we ought to do would be the end of the matter. But we don't. There are things that we know we ought to do that we don't do. So the question is not simply how to move from an is to an ought. The question is how to move from thinking about equality, knowing that we ought to do something about it, to acting upon that thought. And I address those two issues independently and then try and bring it together at the end in the paper. In relation, first of all, to the question of moving from thought to action, knowing what I ought to do, to doing something about it, I argue from Nancy, and particularly from a moment in L'Adoration, that there is no such move. What we think is only thinking is always already acting in a situation. And I draw for that on Nancy's notion of ethos, and also on his notion of love as a shove or a push to action. Nancy argues in L'Adoration that love is what he calls an experience of the singular plural, and that experience pushes me to act. And I just want to explore that as a way of collapsing this difference between thinking and acting, and of moving the question on from how do we get from thought to action to, given that we're acting already, what sort of action should we be doing? Yeah, thank you. In relation to this second problem, how do we move from an is to an ought, I try to understand how that question's working, and I talk about what I call its logic of justification. It's trying to justify the move from an is to an ought. Give me a sufficient reason to move from an is to an ought. And I take that logic of justification and look at it in relation to Nancy again. And what we find really interestingly when we do that is that love is always already present within that logic of justification. You can't address the question, you can't make a demand like, how do you get from an is to an ought for Nancy, without love already. And that's important because love is already there at the root of justice. So we don't have to plead for some special exception to the logic of justification in order to use love as a way of getting from is to ought. And what I end up arguing in the second half of the paper is that love is necessary for responding to this question of how to get from an is to an ought, because love is that which itself does not obey and cannot obey the logic of justification, not because it's in excess of justification, but because it is necessary for justification to be what it is in the first place. So in thinking the move from is to ought, we must do so in relation to love. I think this makes two important differences. The first one is really just that it moves the locus of this debate, this conversation that we're having in these seminars, a little away from simply what is a philosophical account of equality, how do we justify equality. It moves the debate towards, well, what do we do about it then? What should that issue in terms of action about equality? And it brings that notion of action right into the heart of the discussion that we're having. We can't continue to have this discussion without thinking what it implies in terms of how we hold ourselves in the world, how we respond, how we act in the world in relation to equality. And the second difference that I'm hoping my paper will make is that it now gives us a demand for equality that is more internally coherent. You see, before, whether it was Rancière or Nancy, someone could come along and simply ask, well, even if I agree with you that a certain equality exists, why should I do anything about it? And it was difficult, it showed itself difficult in the discussions after those papers to answer that question convincingly. I think with the introduction of love, showing that love is always already there in the logic of justification, showing that the person who asks the question, tell me why I should go from an is to an ought, is presupposing love in the way that Nancy understands it, I think just gives a much stronger basis on which to argue for equality. Thank you. I think that is a very helpful question, because not everyone will share Nancy's assumptions about singular plurality, about whether there is in fact such a basis for equality. But I hope that where we are now in this discussion is that the account of equality that's coming out of Nancy is sufficiently nuanced and sufficiently worked through from singular plurality through to action to put the ball in the other person's court. So someone can't simply now say, well, your account of equality is incomplete or incoherent. It's necessary to counter this account of equality if someone wants to, or to argue for inequality if someone wants to, with a counter-argument, exposing a set of presuppositions, a set of assumptions that themselves can be interrogated. So even if people don't share Nancy's assumptions, I think that the growing robustness of this account encourages people, forces people perhaps, to offer a counter account in order to be able to engage with it. I think there are difficulties with Nancy's position, and I don't address them in this paper, but in brief, I think that the one main problem is that once you get rid of every determinate criterion of equality, once you say equality isn't to do with intelligence, it's not to do with the capacity to understand orders, it's not to do with anything like that, it becomes very difficult to discern where equality stops. And this came out at the end of the paper on the politics of finitude. Is equality the equality of all human beings, all animals, all living beings, or what? And where do you justify the drawing of that line? I think that's a problem that remains outstanding at the end of this paper, and it's a problem I hope to address elsewhere.